Before America sent soldiers to Europe, it sent money. Billions of dollars quietly flowing across the Atlantic, long before anyone fired a gun in an American uniform. By the time the first U.S. troops landed in France, Wall Street had already chosen a side. The Allies weren't just fighting Germany, they were fighting to stay solvent, and America's banks were too deeply invested to let them lose. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. When the guns of August 1914 thundered across Europe, the United States was officially neutral. President Woodrow Wilson declared that America would be impartial in thought as well as in action. But neutrality is a luxury only nations without business interests can afford, and America had plenty. Britain's Royal Navy ruled the seas, Germany was blockaded, and the world's trade routes were redrawn overnight. America found itself at the center of a global supply chain in chaos. For Wall Street, that chaos looked like opportunity. European nations were desperate for supplies, steel, grain, munitions, oil, and the only neutral economy big enough to provide them was the United States. By 1915, American factories were running on overtime, producing not for peace, but for war. One man stood at the center of it all, J.P. Morgan, Jr. His father had died in 1913, leaving behind the most powerful private banking empire in the world. Morgan quickly positioned his firm as the financial lifeline of the Allied cause. Britain appointed J.P. Morgan & Co. as its official purchasing agent in the U.S., and soon France followed. Morgan coordinated billions of dollars in orders, everything from locomotives to bullets, taking commissions on every deal. In theory, America remained neutral. In practice, its economy became an extension of the Allied war machine. But there was a problem. The Allies were running out of money. By late 1915, Britain's gold reserves were nearly gone. They literally shipped tons of bullion across the Atlantic to pay for weapons. Photographs from the time show armed guards escorting gold bars through New York Harbor, the treasure of an empire crossing the ocean to keep its armies fighting. When the gold ran out, Morgan offered credit. In 1915, he arranged a massive $500 million loan, the largest in history at that point, underwritten by a consortium of Wall Street banks. Over the next 2 years, those loans would balloon to more than $2 billion. For comparison, the entire U.S. federal budget that year was barely $1 billion. America's private bankers had effectively taken ownership of the Allied war effort. If Britain or France lost, those debts would evaporate. Wall Street would face a financial catastrophe, dragging the U.S. economy down with it. President Wilson knew it. His Treasury Secretary knew it. Every economist in Washington could see the same thing on the balance sheets. Neutrality was no longer possible. The United States had staked its financial future on the victory of one side. To the public, though, it was still Europe's war. Americans wanted no part of it. Memories of the Civil War were still raw, and Wilson had won re-election in 1916 under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Behind closed doors, however, the money told a different story. By the end of 1916, Allied credit lines were collapsing. The British were desperate for new financing, but Congress had begun to question whether private banks were dragging the country toward war. So, Morgan found creative solutions, extending credit through American exporters, hiding loans inside trade contracts, and using neutral intermediaries in South America and Canada to disguise the flow of funds. The arrangement worked, until it didn't. In early 1917, Britain warned that without fresh credit, it would default. That default wouldn't just ruin the British Treasury, it would destroy Wall Street. The exposure was massive. Morgan, National City Bank, and a dozen others stood to lose everything. When Morgan's representatives met with Treasury officials that winter, they made their position clear. If Britain falls, we fall. And then, as if on cue, the world provided a pretext. On May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania, a British passenger ship off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 civilians died, 128 of them Americans. The newspapers erupted in outrage. The German government insisted the ship had been carrying munitions. Britain denied it. Decades later, divers confirmed Germany had been right. The Lusitania's cargo hold was packed with ammunition. But in 1915, the story didn't matter. Public opinion turned sharply against Germany. Yet, even after the Lusitania, Wilson held back. The U.S. still wasn't ready for war. The economy was booming, the stock market was soaring, and American banks were making fortunes. There was no reason to risk it all, unless the risk of not fighting became greater. That moment came in early 1917. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, threatening American shipping. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a German proposal to Mexico to join the war against the U.S. in exchange for Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. It was perfect timing, morally and politically. Public anger reached a fever pitch. In April 1917, President Wilson stood before Congress and declared war on Germany. His words were noble. The world must be made safe for democracy. But behind the rhetoric was another truth. The world had to be made safe for American credit. Within weeks, the U.S. government transformed the private loans of Wall Street into national debt. The Liberty Bond campaigns urged citizens to buy government bonds to support the troops. In reality, the bonds financed the same obligations Morgan had created, now guaranteed by taxpayers instead of bankers. For the first time, ordinary Americans were lending to their government on a massive scale. Over the course of the war, the U.S. raised more than $20 billion through these bonds, 10 times the size of the original private loans. The financial risk had been nationalized. Wall Street had saved itself and wrapped it in patriotism. The war economy exploded. Factories hired millions. Corporate profits soared. Farmers, manufacturers, and financiers alike saw unprecedented gains. America's GDP doubled. And when the war ended in 1918, the United States emerged as the world's largest creditor nation. The European empires that had once dominated global finance were now drowning in debt owed to America. For the first time, the balance of global power tilted toward New York. London had been the banker of the world. Now, Wall Street was. The pattern that began in 1917 would define the entire 20th century. War financed through debt converted into influence used to build empire. And at the center of it all stood a new institution, the Federal Reserve, created just 4 years before the war in 1913. Most Americans today see the Fed as a given, the quiet machinery behind the dollar. But in 1913, it was revolutionary. The panic of 1907 had exposed the chaos of unregulated banking. When markets crashed, it was J.P. Morgan himself, not the government, who stepped in to coordinate a private rescue. The crisis revealed an uncomfortable truth. America's financial stability depended on one man's fortune. The Federal Reserve was designed to solve that problem, to act as a lender of last resort, to control interest rates, to manage liquidity. But it also centralized power, to turn money into policy and banking into governance. During World War I, the Fed's real role became clear. They coordinated Liberty Bond sales, stabilized the Treasury's borrowing, and managed inflation to keep the war machine funded. It was no longer just a financial regulator. It was the heart of a wartime economy. The age of central banking had begun. When the war ended, the economic map of the world had been rewritten. The United States held the debts of Europe. The dollar began to replace the British pound as the world's reserve currency. The same financial houses that once depended on London now answered to New York. But the victory had a darker cost. The line between democracy and finance blurred forever. The war that was supposed to end all wars had proven something else entirely. Wars could be managed, monetized, and repeated. In the 1920s, Wall Street used its new global position to extend credit across Europe, fueling a fragile peace. When the Great Depression struck, those same debts came crashing down, pulling the world into another crisis. And when the Second World War erupted, the pattern repeated. American banks financed the fight, the government assumed the debt, and the dollar emerged stronger than ever. It's easy to dismiss theories that America entered World War I to save its bankers. But look at the ledger, not the speeches. By the spring of 1917, the U.S. economy's fate was inseparable from the Allies. A German victory would have bankrupted the British and French governments, and defaulted on billions owed to Wall Street. Neutrality would have meant economic collapse. War meant liquidity. To be clear, that doesn't mean a secret cabal sat in a smoky room deciding to send millions to die for profit. It means something far subtler and more powerful. Once money defines the system, morality becomes the language of justification. Ideals are how empires explain their balance sheets. That's why Wilson could speak sincerely about democracy, even as the Treasury quietly absorbed private debt. It's why bankers could fund wars and philanthropies in the same breath. They weren't villains. They were architects of a new order, where finance was not just a tool of power, but its foundation. The legacy of 1917 still shapes us. Today, the same dynamic plays out in different forms. Wars are justified by principles, freedom, security, human rights, but financed by interests. Nations go to war not because of morality, but because their economies are already at war. We see it every time sanctions ripple through markets, every time central banks weaponize currencies, every time conflict becomes an economic strategy. Empires no longer expand by conquering land. They expand by controlling credit. A century ago, the United States discovered that the battlefield of modern power isn't geography, it's liquidity. So, did America enter World War I to save democracy, or to save its bankers? Maybe both. But history leaves one answer written clearly in its ledgers. The war made America rich, it made Wall Street global, it transformed private capital into public power and debt into destiny. The United States didn't conquer Europe, it inherited it, balance sheet by balance sheet. When governments fight for ideals, bankers fight for balance. The flags change, the ledgers always win. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.